Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another amazing, fantastic, homeless romantic podcast. Today we have somebody very special. Somebody who has worked tirelessly since the 1990s on behalf of environmental rights and old-growth forests. She successfully campaigned for several companies to stop using old-growth timber in their junk mail catalogs, which is excellent. But she has been protesting and fighting and researching long before we knew how screwed we really were. We have Tzeporah Berman. Did I say that right?
You did. Hi.
Hi. Nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So after this interview, you're going to be going here and there and everywhere. Tell us a little bit about where we can see you next and where you're speaking. And
I'm off to New York. Next week is Climate Week in New York and the UN General Assembly. And I chair a project that I founded called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And the goal of the initiative is to get countries to agree to start to cooperate on who gets to produce what fossil fuels, how much and where. Mm-hmm. And it might come as a shock to some of the people who are listening to this podcast to find out that although we've been negotiating for now 30 years on climate change. And, the whole world celebrated the Paris Agreement, which is a great thing. The Paris Agreement and all of our negotiations, and actually even all of our domestic policy in every country around the world, focuses on how much pollution we emit and the negotiations focus on who gets to pollute how much. We're really kind of negotiating for the space left in the atmosphere. For the amount of carbon that can get stuck up there. And so here we are, 30 years, negotiating who gets to pollute. No one is negotiating who gets to produce fossil fuels. So although we have all these targets and commitments, the United Nations Production Gap Report now says we're now on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal than the world can ever burn. And if we do burn it, it will burn us. It will take us well past 2 degrees. So we continue digging and really polluting to produce all this stuff. And we know we shouldn't even be using it, and we already have enough on the surface of the earth. So I'm going to New York to speak at a number of events on the fossil fuel treaty. And then I'll be off to Oxford. There's a conference on fossil fuel supply side policy, which is a very new policy area in the climate debate. And then having a big public event on the fossil fuel treaty at the Conduit Club in London as well. And while I'm in London, also pulling together diplomats and lawyers from around the world to look at what are the mechanisms of global agreement that we need? Like, what's holding us back from stopping the expansion of fossil fuels, even though renewables are cheaper? And we know that we can replace almost all, not all, but almost all of the uses today that we have for oil, gas, and coal, but we're not. So we're looking at the barriers and what kind of new agreements we might need between countries to overcome those barriers, like debt or other issues that force people to expand oil, gas, and coal.
Are there some what we would call third world nations that actually have a jump start because their whole system isn't built yet, rather than the United States and the West have to kind of backtrack and redo an entire system? And there's so much corporate interest that wants to kind of stop that and interfere with that. Do countries that don't have the infrastructure already, could they get a head start on this?
Sure. A lot of people talk about how countries in the global south could leapfrog over the fossil fuel era, because ultimately what energy we use and produce depends on the infrastructure we build. So if instead of building the infrastructure, pipelines, et cetera, and refineries for oil and gas, they could be focusing on building more grid, more transmission lines, more electrification, and renewable energy infrastructure. Unfortunately, those same corporate interests that you mentioned, like literally the top 20 oil and gas companies, are all at play in the global south, pushing and providing significant private capital to those governments to exploit more fossil fuels. So we hear a lot from, especially BP and Shell and the big companies about how they're climate leaders. And in fact, I just read a study yesterday where someone was adding up all of their ads And like 80% of their ads are all about how they're renewable, they're green, they're part of the climate transition. Yet, if you look at the top 20 oil companies, they spend less than 2% of their capex on renewables. So most of their money is being spent on new fossil fuels. And again, if you look at the top 20 oil and gas companies, they have plans to spend $930 billion in new fossil fuels between now and 2030. I always think when we talk about this stuff that we should go back to basics, because when I was trying to figure this out, it seemed so complicated to me. Like, climate policy is complicated, and the solutions on climate change are complicated, right? They're about everything. They're about how our transportation system, our heating system, and as individuals, we feel kind of guilty because we all use fossil fuels.
Yeah. But
what I keep going back to is the simple fact that what's causing climate change, 86% of the pollution, the carbon that's trapped in our atmosphere, that's creating a sweltering blanket over the earth, 86% comes from three things: oil, gas, and coal. So there are three products in the world that are causing the 33 million people who are impacted by the floods in Pakistan in the last month, the tens of thousands of people who've lost their lives due to heat waves and floods just in the last couple of months. The three products. And we have replacements for almost all of their uses. And I'm sure people are thinking, well, we can't fly planes. It's true. Aviation, we haven't solved yet as a human species. Aviation is 2% of the global emissions.
Really?
It's important. Sure, it's important. And it's especially important on an individual level if you're looking at your individual carbon footprint, because one flight can undercut everything you've tried to do in your lifestyle. But in terms of how it contributes to global emissions, it's 2%. So we could probably today get rid of 90% of all of our dependency on fossil fuels by moving to energy efficiency, more conservation, electrification, and renewable energy. Because we can do it at scale, though. I mean, there are massive concentrated solar and wind projects now that are fueling hundreds of thousands of homes. We can do this if we want to. And in Canada, even if we just retrofitted homes so we weren't losing so much energy, started using heat pumps instead of gas, we could probably get rid of close to 25% of our emissions, if not more. And I'm sure that's true of the U.S. as well.
Yeah. And for people out there, it's like the solar at your house is the greatest metaphor, because when you get solar panels, you also realize for yourself that you're making a savings, you're more sustainable, etc. But it's been a long haul. I've seen solar since the 90s kind of come and go, but it's being held back quite a bit. And I think, what's the holdup?
It's the vested interests. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, I've been at this a long time.
So,
years.
Do you know the story of Steve Donziger?
Of course. Yeah, I know Steve.
Yeah.
I work in the Amazon as well.
That's unbelievable. And the thing is, when you Google his name, the Chevron Corporation has rented some ad space at the top of Google search with a smear campaign. And if you go click on that link and scroll to the bottom, it says property of Chevron Corp, 2020. Copyright 2020. Yeah. Their tactics and everything that's going on. And for everybody that doesn't know, go Google him, because he was working on behalf of indigenous people in South America about some oil that they most probably did spill, as they like to. And they ended up suing him and getting him in a whole lot of trouble. And it's egregious, to say the least.
Well, he ended up in jail for a long time and then in house arrest for literally years.
993 days.
Yeah. And the evidence in the case, he won his first case, and the evidence in the case showed that Chevron was responsible for the spills, and they should be paying enormous amounts in cleanup. So they went after him and just kept pushing the lawsuits, which is actually something we're seeing all over the world. These companies have the money to just continue the lawsuits. And they would like there to not be resolution on a lot of these lawsuits, because it's cheaper for them to keep their lawyers working on it and not settle anything than it is to have to pay damages and to settle. What's really interesting is today there were a whole bunch of new papers released in the U.S. on what the oil companies have known and what they have done to try and keep climate policy from moving forward. And, we know from the Exxon New campaign and all of the Exxon lawsuits that these companies have known. They've known since the 60s that their products were going to, and now are, causing climate change. They've known that it would literally threaten life on Earth. And if you read their reports, they're scarier than some of the United Nations, IPCC reports. And then they buried those reports, and they created a campaign to cast doubt on climate science, even though their own scientists were the ones who were first telling us that this was a problem. So it is. And let me be clear, there are good people who work in the fossil fuel industry. There are good people who work in the oil and gas industry. Just because you became an engineer and you were interested in engineering and wanted to work in, on energy, and there weren't renewable energy opportunities, so you went into oil and gas, doesn't mean you're a bad person. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person if you still drive a gas-powered car, because most of us can't afford electric cars yet.
Right.
And we're trying. But the fact is that this is a systems problem. We have all, many of us have grown up during an era where everything we do, from traveling to heating, was built by fossil fuels. And a lot of the profits for the developing world and for the developed world, for especially North America and Europe, these are our prosperity. Is in fact a lot of it is a result of fossil fuels. And so I like to really kind of remind us of that and say there are good people everywhere. Some of them are good people stuck in bad systems. And this is not just about what you do as an individual, but it's about what our elected officials are doing to change the systems, to change the laws so that they support, stronger and more ambitious climate policy to keep us safe. Mm-hmm. And to create transition plans for workers so we can get out of these dirty industries and start really focusing all of our money, our attention, our political and our financial capital on building the world that we want. Yeah. And I actually spent a lot of time in Alberta, in Canada's tar sands, meeting with oil workers. And the far majority of the people that I talked to said, look, if there was a cleaner and safer job, especially one that I could have closer to my home, I'd take it. I'm not a bad guy. I'm not a bad person. I just do this because this was my job. And so I think we have to remember that, and we have to care for those workers and make sure that no workers and their families are left behind in the transition.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. We have to remember that even though we disagree with what these people are doing, and we sometimes get downright angry about it, that everybody's a human being, and with the right methods of explaining it, you can appeal to the sensibilities, and always, we want to care for our fellow human beings. That's what makes us. That's how we've evolved for so many years as a species.
And I want to care for the individuals. I always say to myself, I have a little note above my desk. Soft on the people, hard on the issues. And because the fact is, we don't have time to play around anymore. The world is literally on fire and flooding. And what drives me crazy is going to these UN negotiations or going into, a parliament and seeing the committee to design policy that includes representatives from the fossil fuel companies. That's insane. Look, they may be nice people and they're trying to do the right thing inside their companies, but what's right for their companies is not right for the future of humanity.
Yeah.
And they are not going to design their own demise. Yeah. The fossil fuel era has to end, and many of these companies are not set up to become renewable energy companies. They're not designed the same way. They don't have that capacity. And so we have to stop having these conversations as though the oil and gas companies are going to, help design climate policy, because I see it all the time. Yeah. And they're not. They're going to continually weaken climate policy because they can't move as fast as we need the change to happen.
Sure. I saw a speech with David Suzuki, I think his name is, recently, and he interviewed a CEO, and the CEO said, I'm doing my job. My job is to create returns for the shareholders, and I'm doing a good job because I continue to make them money. Your beef isn't with me, it's with your government. Go make them do what you want to do. Regulate my industry for your own. But the thing is, there's so much money, astronomical, exponential more amounts of money coming from corporate interest in lobbying rather than the people, which originally it wasn't that imbalance. But lobbying.
It's not just money; it's time. I mean, yes, lobbying, and folks should take a look at the amazing work of Influence Map. This is an organization that just tracks who's influencing policy around the world, and they do amazing reports on climate policy. Influence Map, really, really fascinating, and they've shown without a doubt that the oil and gas industry and the coal industry are influencing policy all over the world and international agreements, and they track the numbers of meetings. And another project in Canada recently did this. I think it was the Corporate Mapping Project. And they came out with over 1,000 meetings a year by the oil and gas industry to the Canadian federal government. So you look at that, over 1,000 meetings a year. So that means multiple meetings a day at multiple levels from different people who are people, who they know, my brother, Canada, Canada's a big country with a small population. And so everyone is, so they're creating this web of conversation to influence the conversation, to get appointed to various committees. And then you look at how many meetings of scientists or environmental NGOs, and it's less than 100. Because most environmental organizations, do they have the capacity to meet? They might prepare a briefing note and go to Ottawa or Washington and do their one lobby day a year, and meanwhile, the oil and gas companies are there every day, multiple times a day. Yeah. And we wonder why they're influencing policy, because they just have more money and ability to influence policy, to commission reports, to get their positions heard.
Yeah. We have a similar situation in the United States. Some very, very conservative think tanks have put themselves in real estate right across the street from where laws are made. And they do make 3-4 trips a day because those people are on staff and are getting paid very well to do it. And people that don't get paid as well don't have the resources to have that real estate and take that time. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Well, it's good that we're smarter and getting better organized.
I have no other option right now than to continue to do a podcast where I make it as radical as I possibly can and interesting and try to make it fun for the kids and tell jokes and have fun. But seriously, it's now or never, That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And the great thing is that if you start doing this kind of organizing, you don't have to be asleep to not be worried about climate change right now, no matter where you live, because we're all seeing it in our daily lives, and you can't miss the headlines, etc. And whenever I do big speeches at universities, especially, or high schools, kids are angry and they're anxious, and they have a right to be angry and anxious. And what I have been really motivated by and moved by is seeing the light in faces of the kids who are organizing, the people who are organizing. Look at before the pandemic, Fridays for the Future. I mean, now they're back and they're starting to organize again. I think they're amazing. But hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of kids marching in the streets on climate change. And I went to some organizing meetings of some of the Fridays for Future groups when they invited me to their organizing meetings, because too old to be a youth anymore. I started when I was a youth, but and they were fun. And people, there's an old saying that action is the antidote to despair. When you are organizing, when you can set an objective and see it achieved and be working with people who feel the same way you do, well, that's just a way to keep going, right? That's what, I think it is. Barbara Kingsolver once said, I love her, she's a great author, and she once said, hope is the only moral choice. And hope isn't something you have. It's just something you create. So every day I put on hope like a sweater and go do one or two things that are going to make me hopeful. And it's always stuck with me.
Sometimes the sweater falls off in your day and you go, oh, I got to pick this back up and put it.
Yeah, that's right. It can fall off. Read another IPCC report, doom scroll on Twitter, and you're like, ah! And then you have to go and put your sweater back on. But it's why I love working at the Fossil Fuel Treaty right now, because every day there is huge news, and it's a campaign that has enormous momentum. I think because it makes sense to people. Why are we building more of the stuff that's killing us? why are we stockpiling it, poisoning rivers in order to build it when we know that it's what's hurting us? And so it makes intuitive sense to people. It's really been taking off around the world. And just yesterday, the World Health Organization endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. Very political act for the World Health Organization, along with hundreds of health organizations around the world. And they did it, because they believe that we do need a treaty to stop the expansion of fossil fuels to complement the Paris Agreement. But they also did it because fossil fuels is the number one cause of death globally. That's research that just came out last year. 1 in 8 premature deaths is just because of air pollution from fossil fuels. So we're not just going to save lives if we move to renewable energy because of climate change. We're going to save millions of people's lives who are dying from being poisoned by fossil fuels. And that's just the air pollution numbers. I do a lot of work in the Amazon, and, go to any of those areas, you just see the polluted rivers, in Africa, many countries in Africa, Nigeria, etc. There's a lot of people, even in Canada, downstream from the tar sands, where rare cancers are showing up in Indigenous communities. The fact is, fossil fuels are poison, and we've known that for a long time, but we thought we didn't have alternatives. But now we do have alternatives.
And to reiterate for everybody out there that might be confused about this topic, because we think of it as two different issues as far as fossil fuels, and then we say plastics and microplastics. This is another huge issue. Well, guess what? These companies are the same. They're the same.
Well, and all plastics and microplastics are created from fossil fuels. Not all, because now there are some alternatives, corn,
yes,
etc. But the majority of plastics are created from fossil fuels, and people don't realize that either. At the same time as people are starting to realize how bad plastic is for us and we need to get rid of it, is the exact same time the fossil fuel industry was trying to create more dependence on fossil fuel plastics around the world in order as a lifeline for themselves. So we're definitely seeing big conflicts emerge around plastic mix around the world, but it all comes back to the same companies.
Unfortunately, yeah. So do you remember your first time going from fashion designer to...
Well, you really did your research.
You went from fashion designer, which you were quite good, into research and then into activism. How was that? And what was how were you feeling about that experience?
Well, so I do remember, I will actually never forget my decision to, why I left the Fashion Arts Design School. I went in the summer traveling with my sister. We had saved up money, and I was an fashion student, but also a student of art history. And I had a dream that I was going to see the Acropolis, and I was going to see some of the major Renaissance works of art in Europe. Saved all my money, bought a Let's Go Europe travel pass, and backpack, and went to Europe. I was maybe 21 years old for the summer. And when I got to Athens, it was before a lot of the rules came in place to reduce car traffic in Athens, and before they had fixed up the Acropolis. And I will never forget going up there and seeing it was just falling apart. Like it was eroding from the acids in pollution.
Wow.
And it was dirty and I had what I talk about in my first book as a reckoning moment. Like I was standing there looking at it, so sad. And then I looked down at the city and I couldn't see the city because it was just in this cloud of yellow. And I went to my hostel that night and I was coughing up black goo into the sink. And I went like this, rubbed my face and left a white streak on my face. And I was with my sister, and I turned to my sister and I said, I need to go to nature. Let's just go somewhere, and we need to get out of Greece. Let's go somewhere and that's healthy, and let's go hiking. So we were like, we didn't know Europe. We'd like, okay, where's the next train to whatever? And we picked Germany. Let's go to the Harz Mountains. And we were like, we took a train and we're joking around about like beer and lederhosen, and we're going to go hiking and all these things, right? And then we get to Germany and we get off the train in the Harz Mountains and we throw our backpacks in and we go hiking. We walked for an entire day through a dead forest. And at the end of the day, like no leaves, no rustling, no birds. It was the creepiest day of my life. We get at the end of the trip, and there's a plaque. It's in German, and this couple translated it for us, and they said, "This forest has been left standing as a dead forest, as a testimony to the impact of industrial civilization can have. This forest died as a result of acid rain." And I just sat there and sobbed. And when I got back to Canada, I thought, we are so lucky. We're so lucky to still have, beautiful, natural, healthy places. We're what are we doing about it? And it was like, I talk in my book about like how you squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube, you could never get it back in. Yeah. Like for me, environmental consciousness was like that. It was like a lens that came down, and then once those lenses were on, that was the way I was going to see the world. And so I dropped out of Fashion Arts Design School and applied for an environmental studies degree at the University of Toronto, and I ended up doing a degree at the University of Toronto, and then my master's in environmental studies at York University. And that's also how, so my first environmental studies class was a geography class, and they showed this image of the temperate rainforest in Canada, on the west coast of Canada, these trees, 300 feet tall, like 30-story office tower. Each tree could be the size, the width of a house. And I was like, what? Largest standing biomass of any ecosystem on Earth.
Really?
And I thought, wow. I felt like I knew about Brazilian rainforests. I didn't even know Canada had rainforests, and I'm Canadian. And so that next summer, now I'm 22, I grabbed a backpack, saved up all my money, and went to the west coast of Canada to see the rainforest. I had no idea what I was doing. Like I just had to, I'm like a city girl. I'm a city Jewish girl. I know how to cook. I know, and I ended up convincing a local environmental group to take me out to their research camp, because I could be pretty convincing. And I could cook, which was helpful. And so I ended up cooking and supporting the researchers in the middle of the rainforest at this research camp. And that was really how I got my start. I just fell in love. I fell in love with the forests, and it wasn't until kind of 20 years into my journey where I shifted from working just on conservation and forests to climate change, because I realized that more forests were being destroyed by fires and bug infestations and oil development as a result of climate change even than industrial logging. And that for me was probably around 2006, and then I started shifting all of my work to climate change.
Yeah, and you made a good point in another interview about the effects and what happens. It's not just storms, and it's not just heat. For instance, what happens with the timber beetle?
Oh well, the beetle always died off every winter when it got to be minus 40 in certain parts of Canada, and now it doesn't get that cold. And it just doesn't get that cold. So the beetles don't die off.
Do they have a pretty good appetite, or?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. And so what we've seen is that literally millions and millions of hectares of forests have been destroyed by these little pine beetles. It's devastating when you fly over areas of the boreal. It's just it goes from being these green, lush forests to being these just red, ravaged, dying forests. And it's all from beetle infestation. And that the boreal is important, right? There are 3 major forests left on Earth. So 80% of the world's intact forest is already gone. 80%. So we have about 20% of the world's intact forests that are large enough to maintain biodiversity, water, ecosystem services. And so those 3 forests are in Russia, Canada, and Brazil. And the boreal forest is home to the majority of all of the songbirds and waterfowl in North America. So people don't know that, but if you're sitting in California, you're sitting in Texas, you're sitting, anywhere you see a bird outside your window, it's flying all the way to the Canadian boreal to nest and breed. Wow. in the northern boreal. And so as these forests are being destroyed, we're literally destroying the habitat, the nesting ground of billions and billions of birds. That's only one importance of the boreal. I could go on and on.
It's because you actually went to study them, these seabirds, and how they were threatened. And then you came back the year after that and saw, oh my goodness, they have totally raped the landscape and changed it completely and ruined their habitat. Was that the moment that you started to become a more radical? How did that go down?
Yeah. Well, so I had been studying the temperate rainforests and cooking and helping the researchers, and they were trying to stop these areas from being logged by proving that there are these rare seabirds that nested and depended on the old growth trees, the marbled murrelets. And the marbled murrelets were endangered, and so therefore, if we can prove they have to nest in these old trees, they'll have to protect the old trees in the old forest. That was the theory of change. And so these researchers from the University of Victoria were studying them. We were able to prove that year that their thesis, and we were even able to find a number of the nests of the marbled murrelet. And so we celebrated. We thought we'd done it. With this area, the Carmona Valley and Walburn Valleys were going to be protected because of our research. I went back to Toronto that year to do schoolwork, etc., and came back the next year to help again in the rainforest. I'd fallen in love. I loved being there. And the area that we had been studying in the Walburn Valley had all been completely logged, and they had logged it. Like, there's this waterfall pond pool we used to swim in the mornings. It was one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. And I remember walking through this clear cut and down this new road that had been built, searching, trying to figure out where I was. And then I found this little trickle of water by the side of the road, and I realized that they just blasted right through the waterfall, taken down 1,000-year-old trees, like literally a tree that is 1,000 years old. And the eagles were just soaring around, like looking for their nests, and the whole area had been devastated, except a couple of the trees that had the marbled murrelet nest that we'd identified. So it's a ravaged landscape as far as you can see, with one or two trees. Well, the birds never came back. And that again was like kind of one of my reckoning moments where I thought, the science is too slow. The government's not listening. The corporations aren't listening. What will they listen to? And there was this group of people who came into our camp that night, and they were on their way up to Clayoquot Sound to Tofino because the local community had started blockading. They were like, enough. They were blockading the logging. I'd never been to a protest in my life. I thought of myself as an academic, and I was terrified, but I just thought, well, that's it. And I jumped in the van with them, and I went up to Clayoquot Sound. And anyways, to make a very long story short, I ended up coordinating those blockades. That first year, I just supported the local community, and then I came back for my third year in the rainforest, but this time in the blockades. And a lot of my friends from the local community, doctors and nurses, and they had just all been arrested, and they couldn't go back to the blockades. And so I started being one of the main organizers and the spokespeople of this blockade, and I was arrested and charged with 857 criminal charges. How long did you do in jail? I was only in jail for 2 weeks before a group of very famous Canadian lawyers came together and argued my case, got me out on bail, and then but I faced 6 years in jail, and the court proceedings lasted, it took a year before we actually went to court, but we won in court based on a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I had a right to free speech. I had a right to organize, and people who choose to do civil disobedience are making their own personal choice. So I was being charged with aiding and abetting the 867 people that had made the choice to do civil disobedience, and we argued that was not legal, that I had a right to free speech, and we won. So luckily, didn't go to jail for 6 years, but that was formative for me. And after that, I just couldn't stop organizing, and I just didn't look back. That was when I was 23. I'm 53 now, so 30 years into environmental campaigns. And I would say that as people often say, so you were radicalized, now you do blockades. I think we need every tool in our toolbox. Yes. And I have sat in boardrooms wearing suits and negotiated with some of the largest corporations in the world. I've made agreements with corporations and governments in order to get them to do certain things. And then when people hear about that, they go, oh, you used to be a protester, a blockade, and now you're more reasonable, you want dialogue. And I said, I've always wanted dialogue, but sometimes the vested interests won't listen. And so you have to dust off those placards, or you have to blockade. Yeah. And so I think it's all of it, all of the time, depending on which is the right tool. And in fact, I was arrested again, blockading logging in the rainforest just last year.
Oh man, you're my hero. You're doing. That's the thing. Is I know what that's like to be under the pressure from. They want to punish you and throw you into jail for what you believe, and
and I hate jail. Jail's not fun.
It sucks.
It's not like people think that somehow it's something that glorified, or you're like, it's so great you did this and things like that, and it's like I don't want to. That's the last hope. Try everything else first, but sometimes civil disobedience is necessary. And I honestly, I look at all those kids marching Fridays for the Future, and I have marched with them. I encourage other people to as well. And XR, I love Extinction Rebellion. Anyone who is willing to stand up right now and say, no, this can't be what we're doing, because every ton of carbon right now that we allow to go into the atmosphere causes deaths. Yeah. Every ton of carbon that we save from going into the atmosphere will save lives.
Yeah.
So I get a lot of people saying to me like, well, do we still have time? And, it's gotten so bad. We're just going to go past 2 degrees. Anything we can do right now to stop pollution, to stop carbon from going into the atmosphere, to reduce fossil fuel use is going to save lives. And it's going to make the future easier for the next generation. So it's never too late, in my opinion, to start organizing.
I hope you're right. And the apathy is getting pretty thick right now with a lot of people. But we can't throw shade on this whole idea. And as every minute we're resting, they're plotting against us. And they want, I don't know what they want, some kind of dystopian future where they control all the water and those things. I don't know. But
I don't know. I think it's mostly that they just all want to be the last one standing. Every company I meet with and every country I meet with understands that climate change is happening. But they all think, but our oil is the best. Oh, it's okay if we do this one LNG project or this fracking project because it's ours is okay. Ours can fit. But what people need to know is that the science shows that there's no more room for new fossil fuel projects. We already have enough. We have enough fossil fuels either above the surface of the earth or under construction to use while we transition to a cleaner and safer economy. So no new project is okay.
Yeah.
And they all want to just kind of show that they're going to be the last barrel sold. And that's the problem. And that's why we need a fossil fuel treaty.
And we're going to get it thanks to our awesome guest, Tzeporah Berman, activist, badass, scholar, you name it. She is doing the work that you guys should be doing. And let's all get together and whatever you can do. If you want to protest, if you want to write some laws, use your resources and let's try to get this message across to these people.
Absolutely. Join us at fossilfueltreaty.org or stand.earth, where those are the 2 organizations that I run campaigns, and there's lots of opportunities for people to engage.
There you go. You heard it from her. Check it out. I'll leave some links below like the other people do on YouTube. Check it out. We're going to wave goodbye to everybody out there. Bye. Thanks for coming.
Bye. Thank you.